The rain fell like a soft whisper against the windows of Manhattan's towering skyline, washing the city in streaks of silver and melancholy, as Richard Lancaster leaned back in his custom Italian leather seat in the rear of his chauffeured Rolls-Royce, staring at the blur of lights outside with a heart far heavier than his portfolio. At 64, he had everything a man could dream of, the title of the world's fourth richest man, a sprawling global empire under Lancaster Global that controlled everything from energy to tech, a mansion overlooking Central Park, and statues in his image being installed at business schools across the country, yet none of it could fill the aching void that had widened in his chest over the last 20 years since his daughter, Emily, had vanished after a heart-wrenching argument that had torn their family apart. He had lost his wife to cancer a year after Emily ran away, leaving him in a world of silence and shadows, where the echo of her laughter haunted the cold hallways of his estate, and though he had spent millions hiring the best private investigators, launching campaigns to find her, and even secretly donating to organizations that helped runaways and foster youth in hopes that one day, somehow, she'd cross paths with one of them and reach out, all efforts had ended in silence, and regret had slowly turned into a bitter companion that kept him awake most nights, especially when he saw other fathers walking hand in hand with daughters down the avenues, a sight that once meant nothing to him but now struck like a dagger with every passing glimpse. On that particular evening, he was scheduled to meet with a philanthropic consultant at a small diner in the East Village, a modest place known more for its greasy burgers and humble charm than its clientele, and as his driver pulled up, Richard felt an unusual heaviness in his chest, a strange mix of fatigue and anticipation that he couldn't quite place. He stepped out into the drizzle, walked through the door with its faint bell chime, and immediately took in the aroma of fresh coffee, sizzling bacon, and the soft hum of an old jukebox playing a forgotten 80s ballad. It felt foreign yet strangely comforting, as if he had walked into a memory he didn't know he missed, and as he settled into a booth near the window, lost in thoughts of what he would do with the billions he could never take with him, a waitress approached, her presence gentle and grounded, her uniform faded but clean. And as she offered him a warm smile and asked, "Coffee, sir," something inside him froze. Not because of her voice, but because of her eyes, familiar in a way that startled him, like staring into a mirror of the past, and as he looked up, truly looked at her, he saw the impossible, his daughter, Emily, standing before him, older, weathered by time and hardship, but unmistakably her. The coffee pot in her hand trembled slightly as she noticed the intensity in his gaze, and when he softly whispered, "Emily," her face went pale, her breath caught, and the pot clinked softly against the counter as she set it down, stunned, her eyes darting across his face as if trying to reconcile the billionaire from magazine covers with the father she had last seen shouting in anger when she stormed out of their home at 15. For a long, breathless moment, neither spoke, as the distant clatter of dishes and murmured conversations faded into the background, and then, with a voice cracked by time, she said, "I didn't think you'd ever come looking for me yourself," to which he replied, almost in a whisper, "I've never stopped," and suddenly, years of silence shattered like glass, and tears welled in her eyes as she sat across from him, her apron slightly stained, her fingers nervously intertwined, and the conversation that followed was raw, real, and riddled with emotion. He apologized first, not for the life he tried to give her, but for the way he tried to control her, for turning their home into a business transaction, for failing to listen, for sending people instead of coming himself, and she told him about her life after she left. About the nights she slept on benches in bus stations, the kind strangers who fed her, the months she worked at a shelter in exchange for a cot, how she put herself through community college working 3 jobs, and how eventually, she found solace in small towns and diners, where people didn't care who her father was but who she was as a person. She never reached out, she admitted, because she didn't believe he'd care, believed he had forgotten her in a boardroom or buried her memory in the pages of financial journals, but he reached across the table and held her hand, and for the first time in 2 decades, she let herself be held by the man who once tucked her in and read her bedtime stories before ambition eclipsed intimacy, and as they sat in that corner booth under flickering lights and faded wallpaper, a miracle unfolded, not the kind made of gold or grandeur, but of 2 hearts finding their way back to one another through the rubble of pride, guilt, and fear. Over the following weeks, Richard came back every evening, dressed not in his usual tailored suits but in jeans and sweaters, slowly earning the trust of the people she called family, line cooks, single moms, retired veterans, and neighborhood kids who looked up to her as if she were the mayor of kindness, and he listened to their stories, sometimes quietly taking notes, and without her knowing, he began redirecting his foundation's funds into local community centers, literacy programs, single parent scholarships, and food banks, all in her name, not to buy redemption but to honor the woman she had become without him, strong, selfless, and grounded. One evening, as they closed the diner together, sweeping floors and stacking chairs, he asked if she would consider coming to live with him again, to let him take care of her now, but she smiled gently and said, "I don't need taking care of, Dad. I just need you to be here," and so he was. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he'd bus tables during the dinner rush, not because he had to, but because it made her laugh, and every Sunday, they'd walk together in the park where she used to feed ducks as a child, slowly rewriting the pages of a book they both thought was closed forever, and on her birthday, he surprised her not with diamonds or designer clothes, but with something far more precious. A framed photo of her mother holding baby Emily, restored and printed from a forgotten family album, with a note inside that read, "She would be so proud of who you've become, I know I am," and for the first time in years, Emily wept not from pain, but from the warmth of healing, of forgiveness, and of finally being seen. The story spread quietly. First among locals, then in national newspapers that ran headlines like, "Billionaire finds daughter in diner, chooses coffee over corporations," and Richard didn't deny any of it, didn't issue press statements or spin it into branding, because for once in his life, he didn't care what the world thought, he only cared about the woman who had reminded him what it meant to be human. As months turned to years, Richard sold off parts of his empire, downsized his properties, and invested his wealth into causes Emily believed in, affordable housing, education, addiction recovery, and youth mentorship, using his power to amplify voices often drowned in the noise of profit margins, and in doing so, he found a peace that had eluded him in all his years of dominance and deals. And Emily, once a runaway teenager afraid to ask for help, now ran a non-profit that connected homeless youth to vocational training and emotional support, all while still working part-time at the diner, because as she often said, "This is where I learned how to live." One summer afternoon, as they sat on a park bench sharing ice cream, watching a little girl chase pigeons, he turned to her with eyes full of tears and said, "You saved me." And she smiled and replied, "No, Dad, you found me, and that's what saved us." And in that moment, the world didn't need to know their names or bank balances, because what mattered most was the bond rebuilt not by wealth or circumstance, but by love, forgiveness, and the quiet, unstoppable power of showing up, proof that no matter how far we fall, how many years pass, or how broken a path may seem, it's never too late to walk back home.